Good afternoon and welcome to the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus webinar entitled The Soo Locks, a key part of Great Lakes infrastructure, economic growth. Today's webinar is the first installment of the caucus's Great Lakes Great Webinar series in 2016. Here is the agenda for the hour. I'm Lisa Hanairo with the Council of State Governments Midwestern Office. I staff the caucus and am managing the logistics for today's webinar. We'll hear from Great Lakes Legislative Caucus Chair, Wisconsin Representative Corey Mason, who will introduce the topic and the speakers. Following Representative Mason's remarks, we'll hear from our two speakers with time available after each presentation for questions from the audience. We'll wrap up with a few announcements related to upcoming events and activities. Let's start with a few housekeeping items, including some instructions to help attendees understand how to interact with the speakers and with the staff. First, the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be posted later today on the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus website. We will not be able to post the slides of one of our speakers, Dr. Craig Gordon, because they contain security-sensitive information. But we do have some handouts available on the website, so I encourage you to check those out when we're done. I have also posted the handouts in the GoToWebinar control panel. We have four handouts in there now, if you want to look at those while we're on the live webinar. To reduce the possibility of feedback or other external noise, the conference is going to be in listen-only mode, and after each presentation, I'll open up the line for questions. If you have a question, please let me know either by typing in the GoToWebinar questions pane or by clicking on the hand icon to raise your hand. If you accidentally click on the button to raise your hand, just click it again and it'll turn off. Here's an image of what the control panel looks like right here with the questions pane, the hand icon, and note that the hand or the arrow on the hand points in the direction you want to go. So if you clicked on this hand, it would raise your hand. When your hand is raised, you'll see a down arrow. Here is the audio pane. And then this orange button with the white arrow on it is a toggle button that will expand this control panel so that you can see it to get to the questions pane. It's set to auto hide, so if you see this little grab tab on your screen, just this part right here, if you click on that orange button, it'll expand. If you're using your telephone, make sure that you enter your audio pin. If you're using your computer's microphone and speakers, please test your settings by clicking on the settings link. And if your microphone doesn't appear to be working and you want to be able to speak, you should call in using one of the telephone numbers listed and make sure you enter your pin. Remember that if you're calling in but aren't connected to the video component, I won't be able to unmute your line. In that case, please email any questions that you might have to the address that you see on the screen, and I'll relay your question to the speakers. In fact, if anyone is having difficulty operating the webinar controls, please just email me your questions at the address you see on the screen. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Corey Mason, the chair of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, who will introduce the topic and the speakers. Representative Mason, your line is open.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and I apologize for being a minute or two late. I was having some technical difficulties on getting online. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have two speakers to help us continue the discussion we began on Tuesday regarding, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I have the appropriate stuff in front of me. Lisa, I'm going to go on mute just for one more second. I apologize.
Okay.
So I'm sorry. So we're going to continue our webinars that we began last year about the request by the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin, to divert water from Lake Michigan. I chair the caucus, and my colleague, Michigan Senator Darwin Bohr, is the vice chair. It's Senator Bohr, in fact, who brought the issue of the Soo Locks to our attention, and I want to thank him for doing so. I would encourage all legislators who are interested in the Great Lakes issues.
Most importantly, the students. And what we want to do is to bring together.
I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback noise. I'm sorry, I'll continue. So as I was saying, as some of you know, the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus is a bi-national, nonpartisan group of state and provincial lawmakers from the Great Lakes region, with members from 8 U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. The organization has 3 primary goals. First, to facilitate the regional exchange of ideas and information on key Great Lakes issues. Second, to strengthen the role of state and provincial legislators in the policymaking process. And third, to promote the restoration and protection of the Great Lakes. As I said, I want to thank Senator Darwin Bohr of Michigan for bringing this issue to our attention. I would encourage all legislators who are interested in Great Lakes issues to share their suggestions for future webinar topics with our staff member, Lisa Hanairo, either by contacting her directly or by filling out the short evaluation that will appear on your screen when we're done this afternoon. And if any legislators on the line are not currently members of the caucus, I'll have some information at the end of the webinar on how to become a member. There is no cost, only benefits. Now let's turn to the subject of today's webinar, the Soo Locks. Last year, we made it a priority to address Great Lakes infrastructure on our webinars and at our annual meeting. We also passed a resolution calling for more aggressive federal action to maintain our region's harbors, including recreational harbors. The presentation we heard from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers touched upon the Soo Locks, but certainly the importance of the locks for our regions and our 2 nations' economies deserves better attention. That's what we'll do here today. I'm very pleased to welcome our 2 speakers, James Weakley and Craig Gordon, who will help us understand what the locks are, how they contribute to our economic well-being, and the potential Homeland Security implications of not maintaining this vital component of our Great Lakes shipping infrastructure. Mr. Weakley will introduce us to the locks. Since January of 2003, Mr. Weakley has served as President of Lake Carriers Association. As Chief Spokesperson for U.S. Flag Great Lakes Carriers, he represents the industry on a wide range of issues affecting vessel operations. He is a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and is a member of the Coast Guard Reserve, was recalled to active duty following the events of 9/11. Mr. Weakley earned his MBA from the executive program at Case Western Reserve University. He's a founding member of the Maritime Sanctuary Division for the 9th Coast Guard District. He and his wife Sally live in Ohio. Following Mr. Weakley's introduction, we'll hear from Craig Gordon about the Homeland Security issues stemming from the maintenance of the locks. Mr. Gordon is the Program Manager for Capability Development, Modeling, and Crisis Action within the Department of Homeland Security, National Infrastructure Simulation and Analysis Center, or NISAC. So both speakers are joining us for the first time at this webinar. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for being here today. Mr. Weakley, you have the floor.
Thank you for having me, sir. And I'm intentionally going to speak quickly because I want to maximize the amount of time Craig has. So what you see before you is what we hope to see as the end state, and that is 2 post-sized locks in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and the remainder is the smaller one on your right of the screen is the MacArthur lock. So currently you have the Mac lock number 1, the Poe lock number 2, and I think Craig will show you the existing Sabin and Davis in the slide, which will be replaced with the replacement lock if that gets funded. So let me quickly tell you who I represent and why this is important. Basically, anybody that cares about jobs in the Great Lakes region and in our nation should be concerned about the Soo Locks. We literally connect the mining with manufacturing and form the basis of tens of millions of jobs in the United States and millions more in both Mexico and Canada are dependent on the Soo Locks. I represent 15 companies, 56 vessels, all moving iron ore, coal, and limestone on the Great Lakes. To give you a background on how this project began, it was initially authorized in 1986 under the Water Resources Development Act. Unfortunately, the Army Corps, when they did the benefit to cost ratio in '86, in the authorization and subsequently in an updated study used some flawed assumptions. So the way it works is that the benefit to cost ratio has to be above 1.0 in order for it to be funded. The Corps assumed wrongly that there was a redundant mode of transportation. If this lock would go down, all the 80 million tons would simply be moved by the rail at no increased cost. We pointed out to them in 2004 it was wrong. We literally spent 10 years arguing with the Corps, and it wasn't, to be frank, until we had some political pressure by the Great Lakes senators and congressmen that the Corps agreed to do a sensitivity analysis in which they concluded that they did indeed make some incorrect assumptions. They have not released that study. They have at least acknowledged internally that there was enough mistakes that they want to do the next stage, which is a economic reevaluation report, which they have since funded. Fortunately for us, independently, the Department of Homeland Security has done a study on the impacts of the Soo Locks should there be an outage there. So I'm really excited about that for a couple reasons. One, it validated many of the things that we've been telling the Corps for years. And secondarily, it actually goes beyond the Corps' methodology and takes it to the next level, and I'll let Craig tell you more of the details on that. So it was funded in '86. It was authorized at full federal expense, so there's no cost to any of the Great Lakes states or stakeholders in 2007 under another WRDA. In 2014, the Corps did a sensitivity analysis. In 2015, the DHS report was completed. We're going to hear more about that later today. The Corps has agreed to do an updated benefit to cost ratio study. They've initially estimated they wanted 36 months. We've put pressure on them to reduce that. At this point, they're at 24 months to do the project, and that's just to do the study to calculate the benefit to cost ratio. They anticipate it's a 10-year project for construction. Keep in mind it's a 2-year funding cycle for the Army Corps, so we are easily 15+ years away from building in the redundancy that will secure the North American manufacturing base. So let me stop there. So I want to make sure that Craig's got the maximum amount of time for his presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions either now or after Craig's presentation. So Lisa, back to you, ma'am.
Okay. Go ahead, Representative Mason.
Sure. I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Weakley, for your presentation. We have a couple minutes for questions before moving on, unless you think it would be more appropriate to hear Mr. Gordon's presentation and save questions until the end.
Well,
my preference would, go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say we have 2 hands raised, and I would like to just see if these hands are raised with a question or after just testing out the controls. So we'll go first to Senator Darwin Boer, whose hand is raised. Senator Boer, I've opened your line. Do you have a question? Senator, if you have a question, you'll need to type it in or go to the audio pane on your control panel and make sure that you select the button that says telephone, because it looks like you're using your computer's microphone and speakers, and unfortunately we can't hear you. I'm going to go to the next person who has a hand raised, and that's Larry Johnson, or I'm sorry, Johnston. Mr. Johnston, do you have a question? I guess he does not have a question. All right, so it doesn't look like we have any questions. I'm going to lower your hands, gentlemen, and then I'll make Craig Gordon the presenter. Craig, be ready to show your presentation, please. I'm opening up your line. Mr. Weakley, I'm going to close your line for now just to make sure that we have no additional audio on the call. And Dr. Gordon, we're ready when you are.
All right, and you can see it on the screen now? Are you able to see the presentation on your screen?
I don't see it on my screen. and I don't know why. Tim Anderson, can you confirm that you can see? There it is, Craig.
Yes, I do see it, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. This is Craig Gordon. I'm also here with Marilee Orr, who is also the co-author on the paper. As a little background in terms of what we do at the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Cyber and Infrastructure Analysis, our mission really is focused on understanding the consequences of disruption to critical infrastructure. As part of that, somebody told us about these Soo Locks, a set of locks that we really had never heard of or had experience with. And we spent the past year trying to understand the supply chains associated with the commodities that move through the Soo Locks. And that became the focus of the study, which is entitled The Perils of Efficiency, an analysis of an unexpected closure of the PO lock and its impact. The paper focuses on one of the two functioning locks, which is the PO lock. The other lock, as Jim mentioned, is the MacArthur lock. The report that we're going to talk about today was produced after we met with numerous companies involved with this supply chain. We met with the iron ore mining companies, we met with the rail companies that move iron ore, we met with the dock owners, we met with the steel mills, with the auto manufacturers, with the limestone and quarry people. We've talked with as I said, all aspects of this. We've talked with numerous people in the federal government who've been involved in this. We've talked with many of the states that are also associated with this as background for the report that we produced. The report has been finished. It's been shared with limited outside of the federal government. And we're working on trying to come up with a copy of it that we can distribute more freely. It was determined that some aspects of the report, given the extent of the consequence, reach the portion of being sensitive security information, and so it was decided not to freely share the report, but we can share the findings of the report with you. So the Soo Locks consists of two operating locks, as I said, the PO lock and the MacArthur lock. Through that is one of the most critical supply chains in the country. The iron ore mining, steel production, auto manufacturing supply chain. Though there are other products that are produced from the steel produced in the steel industry, which includes appliances, construction, farming, and mining equipment, rail car and locomotive construction. What our analysis showed is that a failure of this supply chain for an extended period of time, which we're going to talk about a little later, what we mean by an extended period of time, would have a devastating impact on the North American economies. So as Jim mentioned, there are 4 locks at the Soo Locks on the American side and 1 on the Canadian side. There's the MacArthur lock, which was built in 1943 and is too small for 70% of the ships that carry 70% of the commodities through the Soo Locks from Lake Superior to Lake Michigan. The PO lock was built in 1968 and is the only lock large enough for the movement of the vessels that carry the primary commodity that we're concerned with, which is iron ore. The Davis lock, which is still technically opened but hasn't been used in years, and the Sabine lock, which has been permanently closed. There is also, as I mentioned, 1 Canadian lock, which is only large enough to allow recreational vessels to go through it. The first shipment of iron ore to pass through the Soo Locks occurred on August 17, 1855, when the 2-masted brigantine Columbia delivered iron ore in Cleveland for rail transport to Pittsburgh. This event transformed the industrial base of North America. It was the iron ore from Minnesota and Michigan that fed the integrated steel mills that once dotted the landscape from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The maps that we see here are accurate historical maps from the era. On the left is a map from 1897, where the red part of the map on the farthest left is the commodity routes in 1897, and the gray part is 1907. The map in the middle is from the 1940s, and the map on the right is from today. The only real difference in the commodity shipments from the 1880s to today are that you have the iron ore mines have moved essentially from Minnesota to Michigan, and the steel mills have moved from Lake Erie to Lake Michigan. But the rest of the supply chain has remained fairly consistent. There are about a dozen integrated steel mills remaining in the country. The likelihood that a steel mill remained open was directly proportional to the distance from Lake Superior and whether it could receive iron ore shipments by vessel. The kinds of steel mills that we're talking about are the old mills where, that, as I said before, dotted the landscape from Pittsburgh to Chicago. There's only 12 of these that remain functioning. The farthest one, Fairfield Works in Alabama, is closing and is changing from a blast furnace to a different kind of production called electric arc furnace. From the time of the Columbia's first shipment, there was an explosion of industrialization around the Great Lakes, and the amount of iron ore moving by water increased rapidly as the cost of waterborne transportation dropped in comparison to the cost of shipping by rail. There was an article written in 1902 that said that the cost of water carriage by the introduction of larger vessels has been greatly reduced, while that by rail has not been lessened materially. The savings is therefore greater than ever. What this means is that when the companies started building the steel mills in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the only thing that made sense to them was to build steel mills that could accept iron ore by vessel. Because shipment by vessel was so much cheaper than shipment by rail, it made no sense to them to build steel mills that would accept iron ore by rail. It only made sense to build steel mills that could accept iron ore by vessel. When we went through this, there were two facts that we learned. The first one I called the quirks of iron ore and steel. What we learned when we went through this process is that iron ore is not iron ore and steel is not steel. What I mean by that is that first, the iron ore that we mined in Michigan and Minnesota is not iron ore, it's taconite. All the iron ore that we produced, that we call iron ore, was actually mined during World War II. This was a waste product that we didn't use at that time, but we have now come up with processes of pelletizing it for shipment to the iron ore, to the steel mills. The pellets have much less iron content in them, but when they get into the pelletized process, the iron ore percentage increases. The way that we create a pellet in this pelletizing machine is to add chemicals to it. Each pelletizing machine will process pellets to a different size with a different chemical composition. Each of the blast furnaces that accept iron ore is a different kind of pellet. You cannot easily change pellets between blast furnaces without changing further processes, such as changing the coal types within the blast furnaces, because you may end up damaging the blast furnaces. Everything is designed to be exactly specific in terms of the chemistry in the blast furnace. So the iron ore that goes into there is extremely specific. So too is steel not steel. This was one of the first things that we learned when we went through this process, is that steel is not interchangeable with other kinds of steel. About 60% of the steel that's made in North America comes out of what are called electric arc furnaces, which use scrap steel and electricity to make steel for the construction industry. But what electric arc furnaces cannot do is make steel that is high strength, low weight, formable, that is needed for the automobile industry, the appliance, construction, farming, and mining equipment industries, and the rail car and locomotive industries. That kind of steel can only be produced in an integrated steel mill, the ones that these 12 that we have talked about. But it's even more exact than that the steel that is made at one of these integrated steel mills is not interchangeable with steel that's made at another integrated steel mill. To change any part of that process requires about a year of testing in order to make sure that the steel meets the crash safety requirements and auto quality standards. But one of the most significant aspects of the testing has to do with the automotive paint. Automobile companies don't buy paint because it adheres well to the steel. Automobile companies buy steel because it adheres well to their paint. And as one example of this exacting nature of the steel, there's one mill that reported that every spring the steel quality would decrease. Nothing in the process changed, and no one could figure out why the steel quality had gone down. But it turns out that during the spring, geese would fly across the mill, particularly where the steel was cooling in water. The geese droppings increased the nitrogen in cooling ponds that led to the decrease in the quality of the steel. That the chemistry involved in steel is so exact that any kind of change in the chemical composition will change the quality of the steel. The steel is rolled into coils. Each one is about 33 tons. One steel company, said that they made 475 different types of steel for just one car company. That the three steel companies combined make somewhere on the order of 1,500 different types for the auto industry. Every single part of your car that is made from steel is made from a different type of steel coil, none of which are interchangeable with another type of steel coil. The inability to make just one type of steel will lead to a car company not being able to produce an automobile. So we go through here just as background as to how a steel mill operates, but I'm going to skip that section and go through our hypothetical closing scenario. What we contemplated what would happen for an extended closure. There have been a number of studies that looked at shorter-term closure, somewhere on the order of 1 week to 30 days. And there's a famous Army Corps study that looked at a 30-day closure and determined that there was about $160 million impact from that. What we wanted to do was to look at a longer-term closure to see if there were greater impacts if the locks would be closed for an extended period of time. We did not consider what would potentially cause a longer-term closure. That's something that the Corps has done a lot of analysis of. Our only concern was, what is the consequence of this longer-term closure? I do want to say, though, that after we completed the study, we did determine that a shorter-term closure, far shorter than the 6 months, somewhere maybe on the order of 6 weeks, would lead to the same kind of employment impacts as we have described herein. Our closure scenario goes as such. Every year, the Soo Locks closes from January 15th to March 25th for a number of reasons, one of which includes maintenance at the locks. We hypothesized that for whatever reason, as I said, the locks don't reopen on March 25th, and that the Army Corps announces force majeure that the locks are going to be closed for a 6-month period of time. We then thought through what would happen after that event occurred. And so we walked through on this slide the different things that would happen month by month. Somewhere around the beginning to mid-April, the steel mills would start running out of iron ore. We had, from historical precedent in 2014, examples of where Gary Works particularly had to declare force majeure that they ran out of iron ore because of the fact that they could not get any shipments through the ice in 2014. We know that last year they had a bigger supply of excess inventory, so they would be able to last longer than the first to second week of April, but somewhere around mid-April, we would start to see steel mills running out of iron ore. After that, you probably have about another month's worth of steel supply in the supply chain before the auto industry has to begin shutting down. They're going to go through a process of trying to rationalize their supply chains. As we saw during the closure of the ports in LA Long Beach, that there were auto industries that were flying in auto parts in order to try to keep their lines going as long as possible. The auto companies are likely to shut down some of their less profitable automobiles in order to keep production of their more profitable ones. But at some point between mid-May and the end of May, they're going to run out of steel and will not be able to produce an automobile. And this goes also for the appliance industries. This also goes for the other industries that we mentioned. When we get to the 6-month period at the end of September, the steel mills are not going to begin operating immediately. I mean, first of all, they have to go through a process of checking their blast furnaces and their coal batteries to make sure that they are all functional. There are historical examples of where a blast furnace shut down for a period of time, and when they went to restart it, found out that they now have a paperweight that had to be cleaned out and restarted, which took another 6 months and hundreds of millions of dollars to fix. Assuming that everything worked properly, we don't believe that the steel mills would start operating until about mid-December. And the reason for that is that they need to get enough supply of iron ore at their docks in order to make it through the typical winter closure. The normal pattern is that the steel mills have essentially no supply on hand when they reopen on March 25th, the Soo Locks. When the Soo Locks reopens on March 25th, by the time that they get through the summer and into the fall, they've built up stocks that will get them through the winter closure. Our hypothesis is, and industry confirmed with to us, that they really are not going to restart production until they have enough supply on hand to keep them going through the winter so that they don't have to close down. We assume, again, that that's about somewhere in early to mid-December that they will start production again. The auto industry then told us that it probably is going to take them another 10 to 12 weeks to have enough supply of steel throughout their supply chain before they get started producing automobiles. So we're looking at somewhere in mid-April before the first cars start rolling off. We're talking about a 13-month period of time from when the first impact occurs to when we get back to a normal automobile production process. Lightweight vehicle sales in the United States last year were about 18 million units. This was, I believe, a record year, but certainly in line with what we've got in many years, which is somewhere between 15 to 17 million vehicles per year. During the first quarter of 2009, during the depths of the recession, when the auto industry, 2 auto manufacturers requested bailouts, production levels dropped to about 9 million cars on an annualized basis. Under our POLOX scenario, there would be 9 months of auto production at close to a 0 annualized rate. We shared numerous drafts of our report with industry, and the 2 following statements I'm going to read were the perspective of the auto industry on our scenario. The first quote is, "The loss of the integrated steel supply for 180 days would be catastrophic to the North American auto industry, including its tier 1 suppliers. There's no contingency plan, stockpile, or offshore sourcing action that could come close to mitigating the situation." A second company said, "The firm does not have long-term contingency plans for a disruption in normal steel supply. We have limited ability to purchase small amounts of some types of steel on the open market, but would be unlikely to support full production of all required parts for even a single product line." A third company said, "Currently, there are no contingency plans in place to respond to disruption of normal steel supplies." If the POLOC were to close for a 6-month period of time, the impact to U.S. jobs would be about 11 million job losses, and the loss to GDP would be about $1.1 trillion, or about 6% of economic output. Additionally, you would have about another 2 to 5 million job losses in Canada and Mexico because of the integrated nature of the auto industry with those 2 countries. As it says here, Indiana, Michigan, and Ontario would face unemployment rates well in excess of 20%. Kentucky and Tennessee would exceed 15%. California, Illinois, New York, and Texas would each lose more than 500,000 jobs. This chart shows a comparison of what happened at the height of the recession in 2009 to our closure scenario using current unemployment rates. In 2009, you had high levels of unemployment along the coast, throughout the southeast, Midwest, and the highest unemployment was actually in Rhode Island. If the Soo Locks were to close as shown in our scenario for 6 months, the unemployment impacts would be far different. Almost all of the impacts would occur along the Mississippi River, particularly on the east side, but the states in the red there would be most devastated by this, and would be devastated to a far greater extent than what happened in 2009. When we started this analysis, it didn't seem possible to us that there was not an alternative strategy to get iron ore from Michigan and Minnesota to the Great Lakes steel mills. So we looked at a host of possibilities. And when we say that we looked at a host of possibilities, I want to stress that we didn't consider the economic cost of moving things. All they considered was, is it actually possible to move the iron ore by some other method? And these 8 or so ideas were ones that people suggested as possible alternatives. The rail one was the one that the Army Corps used in their initial analysis, where they assumed that the iron ore could be moved by rail. Well, the first thing regarding rail, I'm not going to go through all these potential strategies, but I want to highlight a couple of them, with rail being the most important. If you recall what I said earlier, is that when these steel mills were constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the cost differential between shipping by vessel and shipping by rail was such that it made no sense to industry to have a rail option, and that they designed the steel mills in one way that you could accept iron ore by vessel, not by rail. But then we went further and we hypothesized, well, what would happen if there was some way you could actually get the iron ore moved on their property by having the iron ore accepted by rail? If we could get the iron ore to them by rail, would they be able to operate? Well, we ran into 2 problems. One is the fact that there's the congestion on the existing rail lines. Between Duluth, Minnesota and Chicago is some of the busiest traffic in the country. You have Bakken crude moving there, you have grain moving through there, you have coal moving through there. It is not possible to add on probably what we consider to be about a tripling of the traffic that would be necessary in order to get iron ore shipped from Minnesota to the Great Lakes steel mills. Chicago in of itself is such that the time it takes to go across the city of Chicago, you could go from Chicago about 2/3 the way to Los Angeles. There was a report in the New York Times, which industry confirmed to me, that there are trains that go across the city of Chicago at 1/4 the speed of an electric wheelchair. But even if you could deal with the congestion issue, you have another fundamental problem, which is there are not enough rail cars, there's not enough locomotives, there's not enough crews to move the iron ore by rail. You need very specialized equipment to move iron ore, given the density of it. And that the rail cars needed to move the iron ore just don't exist. We're talking somewhere on the order of about 2,500 rail cars a day would be needed to move the amount of iron ore that we're talking about. We also considered moving iron ore by truck, which is even more challenging in that if you considered the amount of iron ore that a truck could carry, you would have to have a truck enter a steel mill about every 2.4 minutes, drop its load, and leave. The interstate highway system between Minnesota and Indiana would be such that anywhere you stood on the interstate highway system, every 20 seconds a truck loaded with iron ore would be coming one way and one would be returning empty on the other side. You would have to shut down the interstate highway system to nothing but these iron ore trucks. But the problem is that there are not enough trucks, there's not enough drivers to move iron ore by truck. Some of these other ways we talked about: importing foreign iron ore, importing foreign steel, producing aluminum cars, increasing stockpiles. None of these actually worked either as possibilities. Foreign iron ore actually is what it's called. It's iron ore, whereas we talked about we have taconite. the chemistry is such that you would have to change how the steel mill operated in order to use foreign iron ore. But you also have problems of how you would get the iron ore from Argentina, Brazil, and other places that produce iron ore to the Great Lakes steel mills. The Great Lakes fleet is different than any other fleet in the world in that they're self-unloading. What that means is that one of these vessels will come up to a steel mill and in the course of 7 to 10 hours drop its load with there's no cranes, there's no barges, there's no real human intervention. They're self-unloading. The rest of the iron ore ships in the world are not that way. And the reason for that is that they're used to long trans-Pacific or transatlantic movement where a few extra days in the port doesn't matter. As Jim could talk about, the Great Lakes fleet is very different where the time is that they are traveling is relatively short. They want to get in and out of the ports very quickly. And so they were designed in this very unique way, something that can't be replicated. Foreign steel also can't be used because of there's a number of reasons that we talk about in the report, but one is that, again, the specifications are highly specific for the auto companies here. You can't just use any kind of steel. You have to use the steel that has been specified. Even a foreign auto company such as Toyota that may have a plant in Japan, the configurations here are different. The way that it's rolled is going to be a little bit different and can't be done in another place. Aluminum cars, we have the Ford F-150 that has an aluminum frame, but the rest of the car still is steel. And as other cars move to aluminum, they're still going to have steel in many parts of the components, and you can't make an aluminum car. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers called the POLOC in one of their earlier studies the Achilles heel of the Great Lakes navigation system. Our analysis suggests that the POLOC really should be called the Achilles heel of the North American industrial economy. If the POLOC were to close for our 6-month scenario, approximately 75% of all steel production in the integrated steel production in the United States would cease. Somewhere around 80% of all iron ore production would cease, and 100% of all North American appliance, automobile, construction, farming, and equipment manufacturing, and railcar locomotive production would stop. This would be devastating for the U.S. economy. The impact is far wider than just the Great Lakes. As we talked about before, there would be heavy losses of employment in New York, California, Texas. This is something that would impact not just the United States, but would also impact Canada and Mexico. When the POLOC was constructed in 1968, that was part of a cycle that about every 19 years, a new lock was either built or replaced. Jim talked about how in 1986, there was an analysis to build a new lock, but due to the cost-benefit analysis, that lock was never built. This is the longest period of time that we have ever gone without building a new lock or replacing an existing lock. There's always been an assumption that the Soo Locks is going to operate indefinitely, and that's only because we have had this constant replacement cycle, which we have lost since 1968. This past summer, we had the MacArthur lock closed for about 3 weeks. If this was the POLOC, we would not get to the devastating impacts that we're talking about here, but it still would get to the point of having serious implications. And just to complete, when we finished the study, we didn't want to leave this without an idea as to what could we do to solve the problem. So one of the solutions is, as Jim pointed out in his graph, is to build a second Poe-sized lock, combining the Sabina and the Davis lock. However, from a DHS perspective, while we believe that that is absolutely necessary, we also are concerned about a more all-hazards approach. With a second Poe lock, you still have a potential single point of failure because you have 2 locks within close proximity. During World War II, the U.S. garrisoned upwards of 20,000 troops to protect the Soo Locks against a German attack, and the British and Canadians garrisoned somewhere on the order of about the same amount on their side. the president had come up with a plan to build a series of ramps to move iron ore vessels around the Soo Locks in case the Soo Locks were destroyed by a German attack. That was determined to be, from an engineering perspective, unworkable. But they came up with an alternative solution, which was to use the Port of Escanaba. The Port of Escanaba, located in Michigan, is the only iron ore port that is downbound of the Soo Locks. The plan was to build out the Port of Escanaba to about 60 million tons. They began construction. By the time that they got heavy into this, they changed their opinions as to the threat from Germany. At that point, they stopped construction of Escanaba. It actually started taking down a lot of what they built, and they moved the troops that were in the Soo Locks overseas. The Port of Escanaba today only handles about 2 to 3 million tons of steel. I'm sorry, tons of iron ore, but could be grown to somewhere on the order of 15 to 20 million tons. We also believe that there are ways that we could have a strategic stockpile of iron ore somewhere close to the steel mills on both Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. We have a couple other strategies as well, but we believe that there are a series of strategies that one could employ in order to try to mitigate this. The only reason that we would have to suffer from a failure of the Soo Locks for an extended period of time is if we don't take action. And that's why we came up with both identifying what the problem is and how we think that it can be solved. And with that, I would turn over for any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We now have a few minutes for some questions. So if people have questions, feel free to raise your hand and type in the question. Lisa, do we have any questions at this time?
I see one question, and that is, why not open one of the 2 unused locks? Is it due to the cost?
Jim, do you want to handle that?
So a couple reasons. One is the primary one is they're too shallow, and secondarily they're also too narrow. So a 1,000-foot ship by 105-foot wide beam by a 56-foot molded depth and a 30-foot draft can only fit through the PO. In fact, I think the maximum draft on the one lock that's still operational is about 10 feet, and the other one, they've built cofferdams, so you can't even get a ship into that. So the plan would be to build a replacement lock on the physical footprint of those 2 outdated existing locks. Those locks, I think, were originally built in 1908 and 1909.
Yeah, I thought it was a year or 2 later than that, but yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's about 100 years old. They were designed for sailing ships. They were not designed for the modern fleet.
Okay, we have another question and comment from Senator Ann Rest. Minnesota is closing down our taconite mines and they may not reopen. Steel from China is killing us. Any reaction?
Yeah, so regarding the steel from China, if you look at something like Gary Works in Indiana, Gary Works announced that they're closing down part of their steel production. What they're closing down is their tinning operations. China is dumping the low-quality steel onto the U.S., which is used for construction, can be used for canning and packaging purposes. What that steel cannot be used for is automobile manufacturing. And all the steel mills that are still operational are the ones that are part of the automobile production process. Granite City in Missouri was one of the steel mills that was discussed about to be closed down. And again, the reason for that was that they produced generally steel for the tinning industry. There has been no discussion about shutting down any of the steel mills associated with the automobile production.
Okay, if there are any other questions, remember to either raise your hand and I'll open your line, or you can go ahead and type your question into the questions pane. I was wondering if it's possible, I understand if people wanted to get a copy of your presentation, Craig, can they contact you directly, or how could someone go about getting getting this information in hard copy?
I think that the best way to get a copy of this would be a letter to the secretary.
Okay, even something like, it occurred to me that perhaps the slide that you showed with the information on potential unemployment impacts, is that also something they'd have to request in writing?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough.
This is Representative Mason. I had a question. What are we talking about in terms of cost? You laid out the timeline, what it would take to replace one of the locks and modernize it, but what kind of money are we talking about?
So we can only speculate. The Corps, in their 2012 report, I believe it was, or it may have been earlier, said that a new pole lock was about $560 million. Today, it probably would be somewhere between $750 million to $1 billion. To take Escanaba to where it needs to be, you're probably talking about another $1 billion. In addition to Escanaba, the infrastructure there needing to be brought up to the standards of a 20 million ton a year operation. The rail lines from Minnesota to Escanaba would need to be rebuilt as well. There are lines that have actually been physically removed and the steel put elsewhere, and there's other lines that just can't handle the weight of these cars carrying iron ore. The one fortunate part about the iron ore prices being depressed is that it would be cheaper today to be able to buy a stockpile. That is a relatively inexpensive proposition. We believe that in order to handle all of what we talked about in terms of potential mitigation strategies, we're talking somewhere on the order of $3 to $5 billion. But that is back of the envelope estimates.
I would just add that when we had the railroads in for expert solicitation, some of the railroad people estimated to build a rail redundant system to the PO would be about $5 billion, and they estimated it would take about 5 years.
Wow.
Representative Mason, we have one more question. What kind of security measures are used on incoming vessels from other countries to ensure there are no attacks on the locks? Are ships inspected to ensure no weapons or explosives are on board?
Want me to take that, Craig?
That is yours, Jim.
So, so what we do with the foreign ships that come in from overseas, not considering the Canadians, but I consider the Canadians Lakers, so what we call the salties, they will always have an American or a Canadian pilot on board for navigational purposes, but that pilot also provides a level of observation and security. Your second question is, are they inspected? Yes, both the American and the Canadian Coast Guard have an inspection regime at the locks when they enter the system. That's primarily for compliance with safety and environmental regulations, but security is part of their overall survey as well. Once they reach port, there's a port state control inspection that takes place, and at the lock itself, they do not allow the foreign sailors to get off the vessels at all. Where the Americans and the Canadians can handle lines, the saltwater ships have to contract with a local company for line handling. And then in addition to that, the Army Corps has a very extensive and armed security team 24/7 up at the Soo Locks. Certainly not the 20,000 troops that they had back in World War II, but they do have a pretty good security plan, and they exercise it regularly.
That's great. Lisa, in lieu of any other questions, I would like to thank both Dr. Gordon and Mr. Weakley for their presentation today. I learned a lot, and I know our other members did as well, so thank you very much. I do have a few announcements to share before we close the meeting here today. First, there are any legislators on the line who are not yet members of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, I'd really like to encourage you to join. Membership is open to all legislators in the Great Lakes states and provinces. Visit the caucus's website at greatlakeslegislators.org to learn more about the benefits of membership and find the link to online enrollment. It's on your screen right now. Second, the caucus is planning a number of additional opportunities for legislators and staff to stay up to date on key Great Lakes issues. We'll hold at least 2 more webinars this spring, including sessions on the Waukesha diversion application and our annual review of Great Lakes legislation. Watch for announcements to come out by email and Twitter. In addition, we'll be continuing our Great Lakes policy workshops with sessions for legislators and staff in Minnesota and Michigan in March and April, respectively. Many thanks to the caucus members who are working with CSG staff to organize those events. Again, announcements will go out via Twitter and email in the coming weeks. Then I would also be remiss if I didn't encourage all of you to mark your calendars for the caucus 2016 annual meeting on July 15th and 16th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This year's meeting will be held in conjunction with the annual meeting of CSG's Midwestern Legislative Conference. Early registration for the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus members will open March 1st, and general registration will open on April 15th for others. So I would encourage all of you to mark your calendars today and put that on your calendar for the summer. And then just one other thing I wanted to add for those of you who have gotten several emails and calls over the course of the last couple of days asking about updates on the Waukesha and where it is in the process. And just so people are aware, this week, I guess I should say last week, the City of Waukesha and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources formally forwarded on Waukesha's proposal for a diversion of Great Lakes waters to the Council of Great Lakes Governors. Public comment period will be exactly 2 months long, so it begins today and will close on March the 12th. There will be one and only one public hearing that the Council of Great Lakes Governors will hold, and that will be in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and I'm fairly sure that the date for that is February 18th. I have been in contact with other legislators asking questions and giving updates. I've heard already news that Michigan will be doing its own hearing on the proposal in Flint sometime, I believe, the second week of February, and I've heard word of at least proposals for hearings to be held by the states themselves to forward on to the council in the coming weeks. All that being said, people are anticipating the timeline on a decision to be made in the next 4 to 6 months. So I anticipate we'll have additional policy updates, but if people have questions or comments or would like information about the webinars that we had previously that showed a presentation both from Waukesha for the proposal and then a proposal from those opposed to it, along with the resolution that we passed at our Buffalo meeting in opposition to the Waukesha proposal, you can find those all on our webpage. And with that, I will hand it over to Lisa for any other announcements or closing remarks. Lisa?
Thank you, Representative Mason, and thank you to all our participants today. Remember that you can view any of the caucus's webinars, including the 2 on the Waukesha diversion application, anytime by visiting the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus website or CSG Midwest's YouTube channel at the addresses you see on the screen. Legislators who are interested in joining the caucus can enroll online at the case-sensitive link that you see on the screen. And the caucus is on Twitter at GLL Caucus, so I hope those of you who use Twitter will follow the caucus and share tweets about Great Lakes issues that affect your jurisdictions. Finally, please take a minute to fill out the very short survey that will pop up as soon as we're done. Your feedback really does help us to improve these webinars. I hope you'll join us on a future webinar, and we'll let your colleagues know about this helpful resource for staying up to date on issues that affect the Great Lakes. This concludes our webinar. Enjoy the rest of your week.